Alternation. Another aspect in describing bilingualism is alternation. That is, how much do the bilinguals alternate between one language into another. So this alternation or alternate use of language actually depends on A, the control over languages that a bilingual might have. So if a bilingual is equally proficient in both languages, we might see that that person is alternating between languages a lot more than those who are not so proficient in the second language and more proficient in the first language. Even the extent to which this alternation occurs will also be different. Then, of course, there's this question of readiness. How readily do the bilinguals alternate between languages? That is, how much do they really want to alternate from one language to the other? So this depends again on several other factors which we will discuss shortly. The third factor which is important is socialization. Now, what do we mean by socialization? Socialization would mean that we are somehow so much adapted ourselves, and we have adapted so much of our language behaviors in accordance with the cultural norms of our context that even when we don't realize it, we alternate between languages as might be appropriate in a given culture. So, for instance, in the context of an office or talking to a senior, you might not like to or you might not want to alternate between the dominant language and your original language, while that might be different when you're talking to a friend. So a part of it relates to relationships. However, the main thing that is working over here is actually the socialization. So you would see that more often than not in religious gatherings or in religious context, when people are speaking they use more of Urdu than of English. And then it also depends whether they are talking to the same speaker or they are talking to another one. But in any case, even when they are talking to the same speaker, this concept of socialization comes up. That is, however they are trained, they have been trained in this bilingual environment to use one language over the other or switch languages while using two languages together will depend on that. Then, of course, there are other influencing conditions that affect the alternate use of languages. Number one is topic. Now, we talked about religion. For instance, think of a doctor or think of someone who is talking about sports. Think of someone or think of yourself when you are at workplace, you're talking about something related to academics, something related to your career, or you're talking about your intimate issues, problems, your emotional states to a person. You will see that even when you're talking to the same person, depending on the topic, you will alternate between languages. So when you're talking about more intimate subjects, you might refer to L1. And when you're talking about more formal things, you might alternate to the second language. Similarly, the person you are speaking to or the relationship between the two speakers will also affect the extent of language alternation, whether it actually occurs or not, and to what extent it occurs, and from which language to the other language it occurs between. So the person will be the person, and the relationship that a bilingual has with that person will affect that. Coming back to our example, if you are talking to somebody you are not very familiar with and the context is official, you tend to speak to that person in a formal or a second language if you anticipate that this person knows that language. And if you see that person, meet another person, an old friend who is there in this office setting, you tend not to speak in the second language, but either in the dominant language that the other person knows or in the original languages. Now, over here, when we talk about this topic and person, the concept of social capital comes in. So there is this linking capital. When you want to develop this linking capital, that is with people of higher authority, you tend to use a second language or an official language. When you want to bond with people of your own community, you tend to use your original languages, because that tends to create a bond between people. But having said that, it is also the tension that we can come in as a factor influencing one of the conditions of alternation between languages. Tension would relate to emotional states. So what languages do you use when you are really, really angry? What language do you use when you're very sad? Which language do you use when you're very excited? Now, there is research which says that you might not be able to get angry in a second language, because you cannot possibly use it unless you have a certain degree of proficiency to use it in emotionally charged situations. In any case, this alternations also depends on the variation in terms of variation or the proportion to which you alternate between languages. That would mean you can alternate between different languages within a sentence, which we call intersentential, or you can also alternate between languages intrasentential, that is, after completing a sentence in one language, you might use a whole sentence in another language, or after using a number of sentences in one language, you might use a number of sentences in another languages, or you might, within a given sentence, within certain clauses, you alternate between languages. So the proportion, the frequency, or the rate will always differ. And this of variation, we come back to our point, really depends on the topic you're discussing, the person you're talking to, and your own emotional state or the tension that is over there in the given context.